Welcome here in premises of the company SPP in the Congress Center Dunaj. They are choosing a very actual topic, especially here in the Central Europe in Slovakia, due to the termination of the transmission contract between Ukraine and Russia at the end of this year. Every single possibility that will happen since January next year is still on the table. And of course, one of the options could be that LNG will be the main supply of natural gas to the Slovak market. Therefore, I'm very pleased that we organized this event thanks to our member, law company Squire Patton Boggs, and also in partnership with company SPP as well. Squire Patton Boggs is one of the most experienced and the leading world companies in terms of LNG and natural gas industry issues. Couple of words about the organization of this event. This event is divided into the 3 blocks and one presentation. The first block is dedicated to overview of the European gas flow situation from 2020 to the present. The second block will be about overview of LNG deals and infrastructure for Europe. And the last one is about typical features of LNG contracts and the disputes that arise under them. Any of your questions or remarks or comments are highly welcomed, and you can use the Slido application. So now let me give the floor to Jakub Kamenický from Squire Patton and Boggs, and he will introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I would like to join the Slovak Oil and Gas Association in welcoming all of you here. We are happy to see so many faces, and we welcome you on behalf of Squire Patton Boggs, but also Berkeley Research Group. And since Richard has already covered all logistical questions, I am left with one last task, and that is introducing our speakers. And since the wealth of their experience, I will need my cheat sheet for that. So I will start with Miss Lily. She is a director at Berkeley Research Group's Energy and Climate Practice based in San Diego in California. Lily provides expertise in dispute resolution and transactional services. She has acted in more than 35 international disputes concerning LNG and natural gas, but also advises on commercial advisory matters for major companies, utility companies, energy companies, banks, and other companies. So please welcome Lily. Then we have my colleague, Michelle Glassman-Bock. She's partner at Squire Patton Boggs in Brussels. She's member of our international dispute resolution practice. And Michelle regularly acts as counsel in international arbitration proceedings, focusing on natural gas, LNG, and other energy disputes. Michelle acted as a counsel in more than 20 arbitration and is one of the most active practitioners in the field. And finally, let me welcome Mr. Max Rockall. He is partner at Squire Patton Boggs in London. He's also a member of the Squire Patton Boggs International Dispute Resolution team. And what I said about Michel pretty much applies to Max as well. He's regarded as one of the leading energy arbitration specialists, acting regularly for all kinds of issues related to gas contracts, such as missed cargo deliveries, force majeure claims, hardship, and similar issues. Looking at the list of our participants and also panelists, I dare to say that we are set for a very interesting discussion. So while encouraging everyone to ask as many questions as you have, I give the floor to our speakers now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Obviously, I know everyone here speaks multiple languages, but we are stuck with English, so pardon us for that today as we'll go through. That was a really lovely introduction. Thank you to you both. I think to give you a little background as well about the kinds of things that we're seeing in the market and our personal backgrounds, perhaps we could give you just a brief introduction of our background more specifically, and then move on into the slide presentation, which is up online. So, as Jakub said, I'm Michelle Bock. I'm a partner at SPB in Brussels. I am American and Belgian. I am US qualified. I've been working in gas disputes really since sort of the early 2010s, there was at that time a big wave of price reviews in the European pipeline gas contracts. There had been some before, there were many after, but the landscape was changing a bit at that time because the European gas hubs were starting to sort of rise to liquidity. And that was a big change in the market. Those pipeline contracts had always been indexed to oil before that, and so this just gave rise closer to a huge amount of litigation arbitration as people sought to revise the price. And this had a huge impact on the European gas market more broadly, because as the pricing changed, it had a domino effect on the contracts throughout Europe. So that's how I got into the gas sort of dispute industry, if you will. But I think things have really changed over time, and there's been, since 2020, say, a huge change in the complexion of the kinds of disputes that we see in the market as well. Because first there was COVID, where nobody wanted gas, then Russia cut off gas, everyone wanted gas. And so there have been not just the price disputes, but the delivery disputes since then. And that's the kind of thing we're seeing increasingly in the market. So in these matters, I'm usually acting with my partner, Max. If you want to maybe give yourself a little, shall I move this?
Oh, wonderful. Good morning, everyone. Totally echo the comments from Michelle just then for the warm and kind words from our hosts. It's a pleasure to be here and see you all. Thank you very much for having us. As Michelle said, it's been a busy time to be an energy arbitration specialist in recent years. The market has seen and witnessed a huge rise in issues, not just formal disputes, but issues more broadly. And I think what we've seen a lot of, and we will speak about this today, from an industry perspective, it's often very difficult when you're in the eye of the storm, so to speak, to proactively get ahead of these problems in real time. You are often, and our clients are often, left in this very reactive position, responding to these events as they unfold so quickly. And I think the last 4 years has been an incredibly unusual window of time from the perspective of it's been one issue after the other. And there's been no real time to recover from the former issue before you're confronting the next one. And this is something that Europe has obviously felt as a continent probably harder than others, but it's fair to say at the same time that a lot of the issues we'll talk about today have had a ripple effect across the globe. Michelle and I work together very closely on all of these types of problems, and it's despite the label of being disputes lawyers, we actually try to work with companies at the front end of deals as well, to try and counsel and offer advice as to how these contracts or these types of arrangements might turn out if they were ever put under a spotlight in a court or with a tribunal. And that can be quite useful insight, especially when you look at the number of different governing laws that are often involved across these contracts, be it English, Swedish, New York, and so on and so forth. So it's a pleasure to be here. Please ask questions. We are at your disposal today. We really hope that we can offer some informative and helpful insights from what we're seeing in the market for you all, and to act as a soundboard for anything that you also might be working through individually or collectively. Thank you.
And then finally, in all of these disputes, obviously the lawyers are working hand in hand with the industry and economic experts, because so much of this boils down to data-driven analysis. And we are super lucky to work pretty frequently with Lee at BRG Group, who's I'm so grateful to work with, as really knows things inside and out, used to work in the industry and has now gone into sort of expert consulting. We're working together now mostly on Asian LNG matters, but I know you're also working on European matters as well. If you wanna.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Lily, with the BRG Energy and Climate Practice. As Michelle mentioned, I have provided over 18 years international experience in energy and financial industries. When I started my energy career, actually I worked for Sempra Energy. That's how I get to know LNG. At that time, US is still importing LNG. But now you see that things change so quickly, starting in 2010, U.S. become like thinking of the energy exports and how the new, all the liquefaction terminals now are under construction. So after I entered into consulting industry, I start to get exposure to the dispute resolution. Just like Michelle mentioned, I worked on a lot of gas price disputes and LNG price review negotiation and also arbitration. And also, I worked on a lot of quantum analysis for international commercial and investment arbitrations. Thank you for having me. So I have the opportunity to explore the Bratislava, very beautiful city. And we will walk you through the slides, and feel free to stop us for any questions.
Okay, so if we could move to the first substantive slide, please. Could we? Super. Great. Okay, so on this first slide, we basically go through some of these things that we've just talked about. Now, apologies if this is already very well known to those of you in the room. It may well be. Living in continental Europe myself, I have found that the sort of lived experience here of the last couple years, and especially the last 2 years, with respect to gas prices and electricity prices, is not the same as, for example, my family back in the US or even our colleagues in London, just based on the fact that we were so dependent on Russian gas supplies, and this had such a direct impact on price and market speculation in a way that was really not felt in other jurisdictions that were not so dependent on Russian imports. So we can see obviously here this is a timeline. On the left hand of the slide, we have the COVID-19 pandemic where prices were very low, demand was extremely low. Most European importers who had long-term contracts, a lot of them were deferring their offtake obligations. In fact, most of those long-term contracts with Gazprom had provisions in it that are known as make-up provisions. So you could, if you weren't going to take the minimum annual quantities, you could pay a certain percentage of the price for the untaken gas, and it could be deferred and accrued, and then later off-taken when the demand was higher. And I think a lot of buyers were, in fact, exercising that right during this time because the demand tanked as everyone was in lockdown. As we progressed into 2021, there was COVID recovery, but in the second half of 2021, I think there was some forewarning, perhaps now with hindsight looking back, of what was going to happen, maybe not geopolitically, but certain with respect to energy supply. So Gazprom previously did a lot of sales, obviously under long-term contracts, but also on its electronic sales platform, the ESP, where they were making shorter-term deals with bidders. They stopped all spot gas sales to Europe on the ESP in October 2021, and the flows of Russian gas to Europe began to constrict in the second half of 2021. So we can see here that the price, the TTF price at the Dutch hub, began to rise, even though at this point there was no Ukraine invasion or anything like that, but there already started to be a price impact. Russia then ended its flows via the Yamal-Europe pipeline, so again, the supply is then constricting. In February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. We can see there that the price starts going up then. There was not a gas cutoff at that point yet, but obviously there was a lot of market speculation and fear about what might happen, as it turned out, quite justified fear, and the prices started to rise accordingly. In sort of early spring and summer of 2022, the EU as a whole, but also certain countries, started to get very active in terms of thinking, what can we do to try to head off what seems like a looming problem upcoming? So countries like Austria and the Netherlands implemented regulations that caused a requirement for a certain amount of gas storage to be utilized, and where storage was underutilized, it was often, at least in Austria under the new gas regulations, then auctioned off to third parties and resellers. This had an impact because, in fact, Gazprom not only was the major importer of gas into the area, but it also controlled a lot of the storage and was not injecting gas into the storage. So there was this compound problem of fear about how much gas would actually come in and no storage being used. So the governments reacted by trying to implement new regulations and legislation that would ensure that the gas storage started to be filled, which it was. On the 14th of June, 2022, all of the sudden, sort of Europe-wide, Gazprom's quantities delivered dropped substantially. There was no warning of this. All of a sudden, the gas supply just dropped. Buyers would nominate the full amounts, and the full amounts would not be delivered. In the meantime, the Nord Stream pipeline in July of 2022 was supposed to go offline for its regular agreed repairs, maintenance type of work. But mysteriously during this time, the turbines all started failing, or at least being asserted that they were failing. And the Russian supplies into the Nord Stream started to drop precipitously. So they went from 100% down to 60%, 40%, 20%, as the turbines were taken offline one after the other. This was a compound problem because Russian gas, which was one of the biggest supplies into Europe, comes into Europe sort of under a couple different routes. These include the Ukrainian transit system, the Nord Stream pipeline, the Turk Stream pipeline through Turkey, and the Yamal-Europe pipeline through Poland. But as I've mentioned, the pipeline into Poland was already, the transit had already stopped there, even sort of in the end of 21, and then in the beginning of 22, Russian sanctions were EU sanctions and then competing Russian sanctions were enacted that sort of took that pipeline offline for Russian imports. So that left the Ukraine transmission system and the Nord Stream pipeline. There, of course, was a lot of conflict going on in the area of the Ukraine transmission system, and there was force majeure declared on one of the entries into the Ukraine transit system, although the other still worked at full capacity. And so this then caused, obviously, much more contraction in supply, and then when the turbines started being taken offline in Nord Stream, things came to a crisis point. We can see here in August of 2022, when Russia halted all gas supplies via the Nord Stream pipeline. And at this point, TTF prices reached over 300 euros per megawatt hour, which was a price that had never been seen before, monstrously much higher than anything that had been seen previously. After this, and I guess during this time, I should say that, German power plants were looking to switch back to coal, which is kind of ironic in a way because there was a move towards switching away from nuclear for green goals and renewables and so on, but in fact we ended up having to go back to coal because it was readily available, but the summer of 2022 was extremely hot. So there was not very much water in the Rhine, and a lot of the barges transporting coal were not able to get through. This caused a panic with the prices. Nord Stream 1 pipeline then blew up after that. Everyone was very concerned about what was going to happen in the winter of 2022, but the prices started to go down then. We had a very mild winter because of the actions that the European governments and the EU as a bloc had taken. Storage was actually at all-time high, so things were relatively prepared. But I recall that in the winter of 2022, in Brussels at least, it was impossible to get wood because everyone had gone to their home improvement store and laid in large cords of wood to be burning in their fireplaces. In December 2022, after a lot of discussion, the EU implemented a gas price cap and a pricing mechanism for imports so that prices could not go above a certain amount. That gas price cap was linked to LNG prices, but actually the cap has never had to apply because by the time the price cap was implemented, prices were already well on the downswing. We can see that sort of in 2023, the prices fell and sunk back to previously lower seen levels. And although the prices are sort of still volatile because people don't really know what's going to come in the future, I don't think we're looking at 300 euro prices, and I don't think we'll ever see those again, actually, although never say never, but we do have a price cap now, so perhaps not. So that's kind of the evolution over the last 4 years that has caused really unprecedentedly volatile market pricing and spikes. Lee, do you want to take this next slide on demand?
Sure. So this slide is about gas demand in Europe. So starting from 2021, before the war, the European countries consume like 413 PCM gas, but this dropped in 2023 by 16%. That's reflected in the countries on the slide. So the first, Germany, as European, the largest industrial economy, Germany was heavily exposed to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Compared to the pre-crisis levels, industry gas use was still 21% lower in 2023 than in 2021. But it didn't cause any notable curtailment of the industrial production due to the energy efficiency. So 75% of the industrial gas consumers were still able to cut the demand without cutting too much production due to the various energy efficiency measures. In 2023, industrial output and the gross GDP also decreased slightly by 1.5 and 0.3, respectively. For the larger industry producers, they could use, because they're depending on the external natural gas or electricity suppliers, they can manage their price risk by hedging or the fuel supply contracts. But those can only cover a small portion of the total consumption. So there's additional mitigation strategy need to be provided as a partial or solution. There is also a notable reduction in residential gas consumption and a slight dip in gas usage in the power sector in Germany. Because of the TTF's price slump, that pushing the price of the gas-fired power generation actually below the cost of the coal-fired power generation. And normally, if the estimated price for the coal to gas switching is roughly around like 27 euro per megawatts. Therefore, the coal gas switching is subject to the gas price volatility. The second, for the United Kingdom, there's a minimum government intervention on the demand side of the energy market. So that allows the market to force to largely to dictate the consumption patterns. So the demand, you can see demand response are primarily driven by the market dynamics, and also the rising electricity price has led to the reduction in the household gas consumptions. In the later part of 2021 and earlier 2022, saw the loss of a significant numbers of utility gas and power providers. In 2023, actually, the power and the residential were mainly the driver for the demand climb. The power sector, because of due to the lower electricity demand from industrial and domestic consumers, and also a large part is also because of the increase in renewable energy and the imports of electricity. The third country we want to discuss is Italy. And in October 2022, their government imposed a restriction on communal central heating system. It's aiming to address the energy efficiency. This initiative resulted in the largest response from the residential sectors. And also result largest residential response. So Italian government actually encouraging the behavior changes, and the demand from residential sector is expect to further decrease as the government subsidies for vulnerable household and firm phases out by the end of 2023. For Slovakia, in 2022, the gas decline is mainly due to the power sector in response to the rising gas price, and to the less extent for the industrial and residential, for the residential and service sectors. And in 2023, we noticed the demand decrease was mainly due to the power sector, in which, because of the higher gas cost and higher use of renewable energy, and also because the newly commissioned nuclear plant by end of 2022. And my understanding is Slovakia will add another nuclear unit in 2024.
Okay, so that showed how the demand kind of tanked and why. So a lot of it was government measures to try to reduce demand, and this was part of the EU re-up kind of methodology, but at the same time, obviously price itself just had an effect on demand destruction because it was just too much. But so I think, okay, it's now been 2 years since the cut of Russian gas through the pipeline to Europe. There is still Russian gas flowing in the pipelines, but for how long? We don't know. And a lot of those companies who used to be highly dependent on Russian gas are either no longer importing from them, have terminated contracts, or the amounts have just gone way down. So we're still using gas. We still use it for power. We still use it for electricity. We still use it for all kinds of things. So where is it going to come from? There was some demand destruction, but there's still a high level of demand. And so the question is, how do you replace it? Russian pipeline gas was a huge proportion of the imports into the EU. Gas also was imported, came in via pipeline from Norway, from Algeria, and some from Azerbaijan as well. But the Russian gas was a really large proportion. So, in 2021, it was more than 40% of the EU pipeline gas supply. Where is it going to come from? Well, there's not that much additional pipeline availability in that sense of gas. So Azerbaijan is supposed to increase gas flows, but the pipeline capacity is an issue. Norway has increased exports by about 6%, but the pipeline is running at full capacity. And there has been some increase, but a really modest increase in Algerian production that then comes in the pipelines through Italy. And there are news reports that Algerian production is in fact even reaching Central and Eastern European buyers who maybe were not necessarily their sort of traditional market for Algerian gas. But the real answer appears to be LNG. LNG has been present in Europe for a while, but it is definitely reaching a new level of buzz and popularity as people see it as a way to replace some of the lost supplies. So we have here on the slide, you can see in the third bullet, the share of LNG in Europe's gas supply rose from 20% in 2021 to a high of 42% in 2023, which is comparable to sort of the share of Russian pipeline gas before the invasion of Ukraine. This is coupled with the fact that it's not just the Russian pipeline gas supplies that are going down, there's also the Dutch gas supplies. So in 2023, we in the EU saw a 16% decrease of natural gas domestic production from the 2021 levels. So the Netherlands accounted for a third of this decline. The Groningen gas field is huge. In Europe, it has been the major source of Dutch production since the 1950s, but there was a lot of fears about earthquakes and other environmental knock-on effects that were causing production caps at Groningen, and it is now closed for production, save for in emergency circumstances. So this is obviously kind of problematic in the sense that you get the Russian gas cut off, but at the same time you have the closure of Groningen. So then what? People have been looking towards LNG, like I said, and one of the main places that people have been looking is the US. I think the US is seen as less of a geopolitical risk than some of the other gas producers. It is, I think, seen as a friendly supplier in that regard, also with a legal system that is in English, that is kind of publicly available in terms of what you can see online, and so on and so forth. So LNG supply in the US has more than doubled in 2023, but the capacity is not really expected to greatly rise for another several years still upcoming. As Lee said when she was talking about her background of getting into the industry, prior to about 2010, the US was actually a net importer, but with the discovery of unconventional shale gas through fracking, the US has this huge untapped domestic supply, which it takes through the network as feed gas to the liquefaction terminals. Many of the liquefaction terminals that are existing were originally designed to be import terminals, but then were converted to export terminals, and there are new ones being built all the time. So moving briefly then to the issue of the Russia-Ukraine gas transit contract. I wish I had like a definitive miracle answer to tell you about this, but I think your guess, in a way, is as good as mine. I think everyone in the industry knows that the Russia-Ukraine gas transit contract will expire at the end of this year. There is, I think, no reason to believe that it will be extended. At least right now, Kyiv is saying that it will not extend the agreement, and Russia has confirmed that there are no negotiations underway to extend it. There, as I mentioned earlier, Russian pipeline gas is still currently flowing through Ukraine. The two sort of major gas metering stations at the entrance to the Ukraine transmission system are Sokranovka and Sudza. Sokranovka has been under force majeure since May 2022, but Sudza is still open for business and has a huge capacity of flows. Publicly available information indicates that about 14 BCM of gas is still flowing through Ukraine from Russia in the course of 2023. So what will happen if this transit contract is not renewed, which right now looks to be the case? Ukraine has indicated that the importers themselves could take the gas at Sudza. So that's the entry point. And instead of having the Ukraine transmission services operator be responsible for it and for the importers to have the delivery point where they take title further into Europe, you could take it on the Ukrainian border. But an interconnection agreement would be required. An interconnection agreement is an agreement between the transmission service operators from the two different systems that will govern the procedures for how gas is transmitted, withdrawn, measured between systems. And so you would need an interconnection agreement then still between the transmission services operators to do that. Importers could start booking capacity themselves in the Ukraine system. I think this is a little bit of a chicken and an egg issue in that in order to make that possible, there needs to be some demand and some volume to do it. But who wants to be the first mover in this regard? And what will be the cost of that transit? The cost will be reflected in terms of the level of interest. The more bookings there are, the more transit there is, the lower the price will be. But at least for the first movers, that cost could be kind of prohibitive. And then, of course, there's the shipper pay agreement that Slovakian entities have with Gazprom that ends in 2028. So that's 4 years after the expiry of the transit agreement. You know, what will happen then to that agreement? You know, if it's shipper pay, Gazprom should still be paying if they're not shipping. But if Gazprom can't get the gas from Russia to Slovakia, then, you know, what happens? And is there some legal defense available for Gazprom to simply refuse to pay because they could say that the contract is frustrated or impossible to perform? So I think these are all of the kind of issues that are right now really the great unknown. I think everyone recognizes that they are issues and that there will be some kind of potentially problems upcoming in the next little while, somewhat urgently, but you know, how those are resolved and how the gas is replaced and transited, I think, is not at this point known. Lee, do you have anything you want to add on that, or?
For the specific Ukraine transit contract, I think the pressure is on the Central Europe, especially like Slovakia, Hungary, and Austria, because of the relatively less lack of you know, other alternatives. For Hungary, there's some viable option that gas can, you know, be increased via the Turk Stream. Its branches like through the Bulgaria and the Serbia, replacing the Russian gas with Turkish gas. And also because Hungary also can receive the LNG, you know, regas LNG from Croatia. Croatia is currently building or expanding the pipeline, which could increase the gas volume delivered to Hungary. For Austria, they already send a signal that prepare to a full stop starting in 2025 of receiving Russian gas. But they are looking for alternative supply from Norway, and also they have booked the capacity in one of the LNG terminals at Rotterdam. They also signed a contract with USA LNG exporters for the long-term LNG contracts. Slovakia is different from the other two countries because it's heavily reliant on the Russian gas, and it's around I think it's 1/3 of the gas is from Russia, and currently doesn't really have much commercially viable alternatives to receiving the rerouted gas. So there's a possibility to organize a reverse flow from the Austria hub, or receiving gas from small German LNG terminals. We noticed there's some, possibility that Slovakia also developing a LNG regasification terminal. But based on the public information, we haven't found more about this. And probably you can share if you know some insights after the workshop.
So I think if we talk about the future of Russian gas transit and supply into Europe, as I mentioned, although Russian pipeline gas has been constricted significantly in the last 2 years, we've seen a large rise in the import of LNG, and some of that is Russian LNG. So I would turn over now to Max, who's really an LNG specialist, to talk a little bit about the impact of sanctions on the Russian LNG projects.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I think it's quite easy to forget when you sit and you read the news throughout the last sort of 2 years that Russia actually has a huge amount of LNG capability. Everyone reads the press and sees all the headlines about gas pipelines and the interruptions and terminations and force majeures, but actually there are a number of projects around the Russian seaboard which have also been impacted. And the main sort of influencing impact in that regard has been sanctions. And, you know, these are major projects, either under development or in full production. And I think it's fair to say that the sort of the US has taken an opportunity to sort of lead the way with sanctions. And it's no coincidence, as we saw on the slides previously, that in an ever-expanding LNG global marketplace, the US has been one of the major exporters into Europe at a time when Russian supplies were being curtailed. But Russian sanctions, sanctions on Russian LNG facilities really started through the US and also with the UK, targeting companies such as Gazprom, Novatek, and others. And most recently, and I think this is why we're speculating now as to what the EU may do next, but in November last year, we saw some pretty stringent sanctions from the US, the OFAC measures, on Arctic 2, which basically were designed to stop its allies from being able to purchase gas when it became available. A lot of these contracts start from Arctic 2 in 2025 onwards, and the sanctions were designed to sort of prohibit the sale and purchase of the commodity under those contracts, which obviously leaves a number of these international buyers in quite a precarious situation. But we also saw a number of other types of sanctions, specifically transportation-related ones on LNG tankers. A number of these projects are in some quite remote and, should we say, difficult places to get to with some quite challenging weather, and so specific tankers are required, icebreaker tankers and whatnot. And a number of these tankers are sitting in shipyards, dry docked in South Korea, because you can't rent or purchase them at the moment. So a lot of companies have been left in this situation where they are unable to fulfill on future contractual commitments, which is obviously left quite a puzzling question for boards and management to answer as to what they do for security of supply in the future. And I think right now we're all sort of sitting and waiting to see what the EU may do next, and if it sort of mirrors any of the steps taken with Arctic 2 in particular, but also with Novatek and Yamal, and to some extent the Sakhalin projects as well. So we will eagerly await news and developments in that regard.
I think it's reported that the EU is considering new sanctions that would include restrictions on 3 specific projects, which is Arctic 2, which is, Arctic 2, is that a Novatek project? Yeah. Ust-Luga, which I think is a Gazprom project, and Murmansk, which is again a Novatek project. And then on the re-export of Russian LNG. So right now, it seems still okay to import Russian LNG, although depending on how the sanctions are levied against which projects, this could make a big difference. Right now, there's still quite a bit of export and import that's coming from the Sakhalin project in Russia, which is a Gazprom project. There are, in 2025, there will be substantial new supplies from Qatar and from the US, which are expected to come online, either from trains that are being expanded or new projects that are expected to come online. Lee, do you want to talk a little bit about the graph on the right-hand side with the liquefaction terminal capacity?
Yeah. So on the chart on the right side is regarding the new liquefaction terminal capacity. So including the terminal become operational post-2021, and also the terminal under construction. So it's all like post-FID projects. So you will see a substantial new energy supply from Qatar and the United States during the 2025 and 2026. That will potentially reducing the option to reduce Europe's dependency on Russian gas and LNG. Actually, I just saw the news yesterday. For the first time, the European Commission officially to start to, thinking about raise the sanction on the Russian LNG. But the current measure is only for preventing them to re-exporting. So it's not like to ban the LNG for Russia completely.
And I think we'll come to a little bit later in the presentation, but as Lee was saying, although cutting down on Russian pipeline supply may be replaced by LNG from the US and from other places, but as we'll come to in the third section, LNG contracts are very different than pipeline contracts, and specifically US LNG contracts are very different. It's that they're kind of they're all sort of priced the same way. They don't necessarily have price review or price reopener clauses. So you sign a 25-year contract, what you see is what you get, which on the one hand is helpful for predictability, for hedging, for sort of determining your financial exposure. On the other hand, it's very difficult for reacting to changes in the market in order to sort of remodel the price in that regard. So that is the end of the first topic. We would now move on to sort of now the rise of LNG in Europe, the terminals, the FSRUs, and some of the new deals that are reported to be concluded.
May I interrupt you with some questions?
Yes.
Because it should be interactive.
Yes.
Session. Okay. First question is concerning the LNG supplies. You mentioned that since 21 to 23 has significantly increased these supplies to Europe, which currently are comparable to the Russian gas supplies before the invasion. And there are some criticism that before the invasion we were too dependent from the Russian supplies. If it is now not the shift from one dependency to another, what is your position to this?
I mean, I think that criticism is somewhat well-founded. I think that in the former times, let's say, there was also a real desire to shift, not just have one dependency for the other, but also to shift away from fossil fuels generally and try to, increase the renewables and more clean and green energy. The EU has long had, goals to meet in this regard. But I think that sort of 2 points on that. I think the current the crisis that we saw in 2022 showed us that we're just not there yet with renewables, and so our options are somewhat limited. Of course, it would be great to get rid of Russian gas and just be powered by the sun, but the technology is not there, and the technology is also not there for hydrogen, which is something that people are investing in and hoping that in the sort of mid-term we may get there. But in terms of baseload fuel generation, I think it's been made clear that we still need fossil fuels, and that natural gas is still a better option environmentally than coal or oil or some of the fuels of the past. So I think we are still stuck with natural gas in that regard, first. Then second, for shifting one dependency for the other, I think that there's probably some truth to that, but I think it's not like all of the Russian gas has been replaced by US gas, right? There's been some diversification in terms of supplies from the US, from Qatar, from Algeria, increase from Norway, some from Azerbaijan, some from ADNOC, and so on. And so I think there will be dependence on your supplier for a long-term contract no matter what. It's inevitable when you have a 20-year contract or something like that. But having a diversified pool of supplies that come from not just one supplier, but a pool of suppliers also from different jurisdictions where there are also different levels of geopolitical risk is, I think, a net positive in that regard.
Yeah, I think that last point is a great one. Obviously, the dependency point is a very well-founded issue to raise. One thing you see a tremendous amount of in the consideration of LNG deals is a debate about security of supply, geopolitical risk, creditworthiness issues. And I think the way that the diversification has taken place, as we saw one of the earlier slides, is the supply network is spread pretty broadly, and in jurisdictions where security of supply is strong, where creditworthiness is strong, and where geopolitical risk is lower. And I think that's very important to balance the risk profile for importers into the EU. So it's not just a single supplier from a nation where, as we've seen, is prone to much greater and more frequent risks than the new suppliers. So moving forward for the next 15, 20-year period, strictly speaking, we'll have to watch how it plays out in practice, but that diversification, I agree with Michelle totally, should be a net positive, totally.
I would actually add one point to that as well, which is that even if you're getting everything from the same jurisdiction, especially if it's one that has sort of lower geopolitical risk, like I'm thinking really of the US, not all projects are the same as well. So I think, and there of course are things in the news about certain US LNG suppliers being maybe more reliable than others. So I think it's also important to not look at it just as a sort of from one country, but from the specific project that you're getting it from, and having a diverse portfolio in that regard, because not every supplier is created equal, and you're just spreading your risk a bit if you take it from different sources. I don't know, Lee, if you want to.
Yeah, I just want to add a point is also regarding the economics, really depending on the cost. So during the past 2 years, Europe imported like lots of LNG, and half of them are coming from US. But of all the total imported LNG, and almost half of them are on the spot basis, which are very expensive if you compare to the long-term contract price, especially for the supply from LNG based on like 2.5 Henry Hub price. So that's the delta, the price differential is big.
Okay, thank you. Maybe one more question concerning what about your expectation concerning the scenario for the Central Europe and the Russian gas supply after the termination of the transit contract between Russia and Ukraine? So maybe which alternative is the most likely? Because when I take as an example Slovakia, we are in a complicated situation because we are a landlocked country. We are far from any LNG terminal. So for us it's not easy just to replace Russian gas supply for instance, LNG as a primary source.
I mean, I think in the first instance, it's exactly right. Like you're landlocked, and actually a lot of Central Europe is landlocked. I think there are other markets, neighboring markets, who are strongly considering LNG to replace at least some of the supply. And I think there's definitely work on the reverse flow and pipeline infrastructure to try to figure out how to get gas from some of these new German FSRU and other terminals, and then in Croatia to sort of how to get it into Central Europe. I imagine that is something that is going to be worked on quite a lot, and will be an alternative for at least some of the supply. The issue is, what about the rest of the supply? And I think that some of that will also depend, I think Turkstream, that pipeline, is at pretty full capacity, but the question is whether some of those supplies will be replaced with others, that it opens some capacity for Slovakia to get from that direction. But I think that these are sort of the main alternatives in that regard. I guess there are some in sort of Central and Southern Europe who are also getting from Algeria and in the pipeline network through Italy, and this is something, I guess, that could also be explored in this regard. I don't know, anybody else?
Okay, thank you very much.
Sorry, I wish there were an easy answer to that,
okay.
But...
Yes, it's not easy also for the decision makers.
Yeah.
Any other question maybe from audience? If not, we can proceed with your presentation, please.
Or maybe Okay, so turning to status then of LNG terminals and FSRUs, what they are, how they work, et cetera. I'm going to turn this one over to Max to talk about FSRUs and what they are.
So FSRUs have caught everyone's attention, in particular since the curtailment of Russian gas supplies. They've played an absolutely critical and pivotal role in Europe's ability to diversify quickly to LNG. There are various reasons for that. Let's start with what they are. They are essentially a floating receiving terminal. They can either be a newly built carrier, or more often than not, they are a converted previous LNG carrier. The main motivations for doing one or the other are normally driven by cost. It's cheaper to convert an existing one than to build a new one, but the cost is relatively insignificant compared to what you would spend for the more traditional onshore development. Now, why have they sort of carried a lot of favor and attention in recent years? Well, in the heat of the crisis, when pipe gas supplies were being curtailed and when decision makers were around the negotiation tables internally trying to work out what best to do in terms of covering security of supply, FSRUs provided a really quick and cheap alternative as the basis to start considering heightened spot activity, trading on that market, but also long-term contracts coming into those countries. Their main assets really are speed, in terms of you can get one up and running typically in about a year, 12 to 14 months. That is compared to the sort of typical life cycle of developing an onshore terminal, which is about 5 years. Another major advantage, as I alluded to just now, is cost. Maximum cost is typically around the sort of 250 million mark for a new one. A lot of the reconditioned ones come in about 100 million less. But when you compare that to the billions of euros or dollars, as the case may be, to develop an onshore facility, normally project financed and then underpinned by long-term or a variety of long-term contracts to secure those loans to get the initial investment. These are a much cheaper alternative, which is why, as we've seen on the graph, lots of FSRUs have emerged in recent years and months, and more under development and under order. But the future isn't always totally rosy and bright in respect of these tools. I mean, they are a very reactive tool, as we saw, but they can also serve as a sort of more permanent function, although they do have a bit of a lifespan to them. They have some disadvantages, which anyone considering them should be aware of. The main one, again, is in comparative terms to an onshore terminal, is their capacity. Lest we forget, they are either newly built or reconditioned LNG carriers. Not all carriers are the same size. These can typically be anything from the sort of 140,000 cubic meter mark up to the 170,000. So depending on your domestic demand or your needs, they can have some capacity limitations there. There's also difficulty in terms of a longer term view. A lot of the time these onshore projects are built and then they have expansion plans built into a project timeline. New trains, expansion of storage, elements of the facility that are grown bigger and bigger over time. With an FSRU, there are real limitations in how much you can expand. So they serve a very legitimate purpose. They have been incredibly effective in Europe. They are gaining popularity in other continents around the world. A lot of the African projects are using FSRUs. A lot in the emerging markets out in Southeast Asia are using FSRUs. They will be here to stay, undoubtedly, but they represent, and we will come on to talk about this later, they represent another sort of what we would call probably a complicating factor of the LNG dynamic versus pipeline gas. A lot more things can go wrong in an LNG deal than in a pipe gas deal. And with an FSRU component on top, it adds another layer of, should we say, complexity to iron out contractually when you're around the negotiation table right at the front end. But we just wanted to give you a sort of snapshot of the role that we're seeing in the market and the intended plans for further development.
So the next slide just has some discussion about new developments as they're being publicly reported in terms of these LNG terminals and FSRUs. Excuse me, as Lee mentioned, just doing some internet searching before today, we saw that there is reported a new LNG terminal to be built at the port of Bratislava by a state-owned company with a potential readiness date for 2026. But there was not a lot of information available about what this was planned to be used for and how it was planned to work. It looked like it was part of the Rhine-Danube sort of planning. And so it wasn't clear to us whether the idea was that the gas would come in on barges from the coast or whether it would be for trucked LNG or refueling. So I don't know what
it's
what
dedicated more to
holds.
the river transportation. It's not for the supply for the for the whole economy, for the households, and so it's just for the transportation. So
okay.
It's not the typical LNG terminal like on shore.
Yeah, I mean, well, its location makes sense in that regard.
Just for explanation for you.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I mean, we see in some other jurisdictions the sort of, obviously the parcels of LNG are smaller, but trucked LNG and the use of that, and so we were wondering whether there was any planning for that to use any regasification there. And then, so this really just has kind of a list of public reporting in terms of the FSRU capacities that are being reported as being expanded in Greece and in Italy, in Turkey. Belgium, Poland, and Netherlands have actual terminal infrastructure, but they are expanding those. Likewise, Cyprus, Germany has now managed to get approved after a decade of arguing about it, LNG terminals, and are rapidly trying to build those. Why are we seeing so much flourishing on this? Well, LNG was not a big thing prior to the cut in Russian gas. So there was existing LNG regasification infrastructure in Europe, but it was mostly in Spain, France, Belgium, Netherlands, sort of all along that area, and not so much in some of the other places. But, we're seeing obviously that there are problems with having just a limited number if you're going to depend on LNG. There's capacity issues, but there's also pipeline interconnection issues. And so that's why we see them sort of springing up in different jurisdictions. But how you get from one place to the other is still, I think, a little bit something to be worked on. Do you want to take this next slide then on the, oh dear, the LNG?
Yeah. So this is another slide just to give more some of the details of the regas terminal or FSRU development. On the left side is a map just showing all the total 29 LNG import facility or FSRUs either under construction or planned with announced like a COD. This could increase the LNG import capacity in Europe by 125 BCM in 2028, which is approximately the 75% of the total Russian LNG and also pipeline imports in 2021. So there are so many under planned or under construction, the LNG regas or FSRU facility, would people will raise the question, would the Europe use all of them? Because that's quite a significant capacity for adding all the addition growth, like possible growth in the capacity. It's around 400 BCM. That's basically is already higher than the total gas consumption in Europe currently. So there's, you can see in the graph that's a projection of the energy capacity versus the energy demand forecast, and also compared to the historical gas consumption, and also gas consumption forecast by 2030. So this forecast is coming from the Institute for the Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. IEEFA, we call that the institution. they expect the European gas demand will fall by 11% between 2023 and 2030, while around like 100 BCM LNG imports are forecasted to peak in 2025. So based on the gas projected demand and also the import infrastructure capacity, so the ongoing buildup of the LNG infrastructure is likely to result in a significant excess capacity. That probably, if the forecast achieve the capacity to 405 BCM by 2030, while the European LNG demand will not exceed around 130 BCM in 2030. So that leaves utilization around only 33% utilization of all the import facilities. So even though the lower gas price currently could encourage some of the rebound of the gas demand, but the structural trends still point to the declining gas demand in a longer term because of all the energy transition, the encouragement of using more clean energy, and also the energy efficiency measures has been implemented throughout the European countries.
That leads a little bit into the next slide, which is really, I don't intend to go through this in detail. This is a list of basically all of the contracting that's being reported on between European buyers and producers. And as Lee was saying, I mean, I think that in the sort of crisis period of 21 and then really accelerated in 22, there was obviously this rush to get FSRUs in place to build LNG terminals because, like I said, we're not there with the technology yet, so we are still really dependent on gas, and there has to be a way to get it into Europe. Now, I think a lot of, in Europe over the last 10 years, through regulatory policies, there's definitely been more of an emphasis on market trading and spot market and more short-term purchases as opposed to the traditional longer-term contracts. But when European buyers were looking to replace supplies and they were talking to producers about it, there was reporting that the Germans, for example, went to Qatar or the US and were asking for more shorter or midterm contracts, and the response was no, you can sign a long-term contract if you want the LNG. And so there were a number of contracts that have been entered into that are 15, 20, 25-year contracts for LNG that have now been signed. OMV is signed with Cheniere. Qatar Gas has been very active and has signed a number of these contracts, which are for relatively decent sized volume, which will last for a long time. And so on the one hand, this provides a level of stability that we know that there's going to be gas coming in and a relatively sufficient supply. But on the other hand, as Europe moves towards trying to meet its green energy goals and cut down on emissions and promote wind, solar, hydro, et cetera, there's now these long-term LNG procurement contracts that are in place. Do you want to take the price?
So on the chart, you can see this. We compare the TTF spot and future price at different time points. So within the pre-war level, which are far below the 50 euro and per megawatts, based on the future price as of July 2021. Then after on the February 24, 2022, when Russia started the full scale of the invasion of Ukraine, the price rocked to almost 150, but the longer term will decline to 50 or below 50 price level. Then after the Nord Stream explosion on September 26, the price reached the record high and gradually decline. So for the current European gas price already start to dip as gas demand, also the economy recovery damped. With the upcoming supply from the US and Qatar by 2025 and 2026, so price expect as of now, if you look at the red line, which is the TTF future price, on May 3rd this year, that expect to, return to like 30 or to 40 price level. However, the price could return with increased manufacturing activities or like a delayed LNG project or some, because the ongoing political tensions on Red Sea could impact the transportation of LNG. While Russian pipeline gas supply into Europe remains significantly less than the pre-war levels, the LNG import from Russia actually increased from like 14 BCM in 2021 to the 18 BCM last year. And as I mentioned before, the European buyers imported almost half of the LNG, like 47% on the spot or short-term basis. Their price are much higher than the price under the newly signed Henry Hub long-term LNG SPAs.
So I think as the longer-term SPAs come online, that could have real impact on price. Like I said, maybe you don't have a price review clause, so maybe it won't change, but you will know what the price is, and so there probably will be some smoothing there as those contracts start to come online. And then finally, this is just a summary to finish this section before we move into talking about LNG contracts specifically and how they work, that shows the different European LNG flows, where they come from on the left, and then where they go on the right. And you can see that like the US is a major source now, far bigger than any of the rest, going to all of the places. So I think this goes a little bit to the earlier question about potentially trading one dependency for the other, because you can see that there really is a real concentration on one of the sources. So that's the end of this block.
Okay. Just one short question. In the previous slide, you mentioned that last year, the European buyers imported almost half of the LNG on the spot prices. For the future, do you think that the long-term contracts will prevail in this respect?
Yeah, I did actually a quick calculation yesterday just to see what's the U.S. price could give. If, for example, 2023, the average Henry Hub price is $2.5 US dollar per MMBTU. If you translate that into like a Henry Hub index long-term SPA, that's around for the DES price will be around like $8 to $9 per MMBTU for the U.S. energy arriving in the Europe. But if you look at oil index, the recently signed, which is around like 14%, then you convert by the 2023, like oil is like $83 per barrel. So that will translate like $12 per MMBTU. And also depending on the spot price, like TTF would, so that shows like Henry Hub index energy price definitely has more like cost competitiveness compared to other sources.
Okay.
But I think on more specifically on whether the long-term price will prevail or whether the long-term contracts will prevail over spot, I think that's actually a quite difficult question. And I think that just me personally, I would see it as still being kind of half-half, because we have the infrastructure in Europe to have liquid trading hubs now in a way that other parts of the world don't have. Like, we don't see this in Asia, for example. In Asia, the market is really composed, still the backbone of the market is long-term contracts, because you don't have a liquid hub like you have TTF or the Austrian hub or, you know, PSV or any of those, really. And I think the issue with LNG, which we'll come on to in a minute, is LNG comes in a cargo. So it's not a matter of just getting, you know, 1 BCM a year through the pipeline. It's like you have to purchase a cargo or part of a cargo. And so I think that there are going to be some markets where, you know, smaller countries where it just doesn't make sense for them to enter into a long-term contract. The economies of scale aren't there. And so I think that what we'll find is that we may be like regressing a little bit in the market to have, again, more long-term contracts for some buyers, but I think that there will still be excess gas that will then be sold on the hub, you know, through the pipelines in the same way that we've seen in the past. So I don't see like long-term contracts replacing short-term spot prices in that way. I think that there will be some backbone of long-term contracting, and then there will again be incremental parts made up of spot trading.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? If not, of course, we can move to the next section.
Okay, I'm going to turn over to Max here. In this section, the idea is that we'll be talking a little bit about LNG contracts. How do they work? How are they different than pipeline contracts? There's a ton of terminology. What do these things mean? And what are the typical issues that we see with LNG contracting?
Thanks very much. So this has become a really popular topic for conferences, for internal debates and considerations at companies. If we're considering a new long-term supply contract, do we branch out and embark into the LNG world? These contracts have a lot of common themes, but they also have lots of points of difference. One of the main points of difference on a cosmetic level is the sheer scale of these contracts. They're often about sort of 200 pages long, whereas a typical pipe gas is, 25 pages, 30 pages. There's a lot more, therefore, that goes into these contracts, or maybe it's just said in a bit more detail. But obviously, with a lengthier contract, there is obviously the possibility of more lengthy negotiation and more possibility, potentially, for dispute. If you boil it back to its sort of core fundamental commercials, you would be looking at all the same major points that you would see in any commercial contract: price, term, quantity, flexibility. Those seem to be the sort of real points that parties, when they sit around the negotiation table, both come to that discussion with their core fundamentals of what they want. And we've seen, obviously, in the previous slides, the sheer volume of activity that's taken place in new deals. And with each of those deals, those sort of 4 pillars would have been ever present in each one of those discussions and negotiations. We haven't, you'll be very pleased to know, included all of these terms. As Michelle said, there are some, there's a horrid amount of acronyms that exist in these contracts that run for pages and pages and pages. And so what we've tried to do is just pull out the sort of the core components that are around those: flexibility, pricing, and delivery points. You may have seen these terms before on the screen: FOB and DES. There is often a misconception in the market that these purely just relate to the transportation and who ships it, who ships the cargo. There actually are a lot of different and related commercial points that have to be borne in mind when you talk about these. Yes, it's true that they relate to who ultimately is responsible for shipping, but they have a massive implication as well on the transfer of title and who bears the responsibility of risk from the delivery point. It's the delivery point, the buyer picking it up at the seller facility in the exporting market and then taking control and risk and title to the cargo on its return voyage to wherever the cargo is destined for, or is the delivery point in the buyer's market, where title and risk will pass at that point as it arrives in the importing country. There are also important considerations which sort of tie into a topic that's been ever present today, which is LNG is a globally traded commodity. It is loaded onto vessels, and those vessels can be sent anywhere around the world. It is different in that regard to a pipe infrastructure network, in the sense that you can have a buyer in China who is buying a cargo from America. There is no pipeline that would link that transaction. It relies on the LNG market to do so. As a result, and we'll come on to this in the final slide where we talk about some of the issues and disputes, there has been a massive increase in the amount of trading of this as a commodity, not just in the new long-term deals, but also in spot trading. You know, we want one cargo here, we'll buy it at this price and we'll sell it on to someone else. Therefore, market arbitrage in the typical sort of commodities traders mindset has become a real feature of this particular industry. So FOB and DES can play a really important role in your ability to send cargoes to other places. If you're the buyer and you control your fleet and you pick up the cargo, you may have an increased prospect of being able to take that cargo to the destination market of your choosing. We'll come on to some of the points that are associated with that election later about profit sharing and diversions, etc. But generally speaking, when the seller ships it, it's either going on a point-to-point basis from the seller's facility to the buyer's facility on a direct route there and back, or the seller may be lifting from a variety of specified exporting facilities around the world and then shipping it to the buyer's nominated facility. So it's a key point of negotiation and one which features heavily with every deal. The second one, and no surprises here, pricing. Pricing in traditional long-term contracts has been without a globally accepted or traded price for gas. The proxy price, so to speak, has always been to an oil product, be it Brent, or in the Asian markets to JCC. These contract prices typically vary over time based on the construction of the formula. And you'll be pleased to know we won't walk you through all the different ways these formulas can come together because some of them are quite laborious and have different elements to them where they can change based on certain price movements of the commodity in question. But pricing is a key feature, and it won't come as a surprise, like in a pipe gas contract, that if you're signing a contract for 15 or 20 years, 25 years, and you agree that price in 2024, yet you're still going to be receiving deliveries into the 2040s, the market that your contract operates in may endure stresses from a supply and demand, which have an impact on the pricing. So it's a common feature of these long-term LNG deals, and there is an exception to this, but we can come on to that. But a common feature has been and continues to be a price review mechanism, where over time the parties can agree either purely temporally or as a result of substantial changes in a specified market to sit down and discuss this price is no longer reflective of the market value of LNG in this market. And you can have a discussion about that. If the parties are then able to agree it, they will then reflect that new price for the new application period. If they're not able to agree it, this is when the role of mediations, expert determinations, and arbitrations come into the fold, where an independent tribunal can assess what the market value of gas should be and what the price formula should be amended to. So delivery modes and pricing are key features. I don't know if you want to add anything to that slide before we move on.
Yeah, I think just to mention the same thing about the pricing. I mean, I think what we've seen in European long-term contracts over time is they started off being indexed to oil and competing fuels and had really complicated formula that had a base price index to a basket of alternative fuels. That then changed with the sort of rise of hub pricing, and a lot of long-term contracts in Europe became indexed at least to either all or in some part to hub, or with different mechanisms for doing that. But a lot of these contracts coming out of the US are simply Henry Hub indexed. And whether the constant might change, the base price might change, that may be subject to negotiation, but the index might just be Henry Hub, and then there's no price review clause typically on a Henry Hub contract. And so that definitely does raise issues about if you're how you hedge the difference, where your source is going to be priced at one index and you're going to sell downstream at another index that's, Henry Hub is completely unrelated in that sense to TTF or to the European market. And there has not been a stable relationship between those commodity pricing in the past. But as we see the rise of US LNG, I mean, who knows, maybe we'll start to see sort of more movement in parallel between price indices that typically have had nothing to do with one another. Lee, do you want to, just on the question of FOB versus DES, like I guess how much are you seeing of each in the market? What are you seeing as more typical?
That's a good question. It really depending on the markets and also buyers. If a buyer has a lease or they own the energy vessel, they could prefer to sign up the FOB with more flexibility contracts. But for the buyer, like smaller buyer, they don't have a vessel, they will have to sign the DES, then let the sellers to send the gas or LNG to their markets. I would say, but obviously for the US LNG, a lot of contracts are signing on the FOB basis. And also because you have the flexibility to, just pay the penalty instead of purchasing the volumes if you don't need the volume. So compared to other contracts.
Can you expand on that a little bit? Like meaning it's not necessarily take or pay, it's something else?
So for the US, like tolling contract, if you're signing like the tolling on the tolling basis, if the gas demand actually is lower than you're expected, you can just pay a small penalty fee and just not taking the cargoes, which compared to and also because if the price were really low, like spot market, you could purchase from the spot market instead of pay a higher price under the long-term contracts.
I think this takes us on to flexibility as the next major factor.
Yeah. So flexibility is an umbrella term really for two types of flex in these deals. One is volume and one is destination. As you'll see in the first bullet point on the slide here, LNG contracts are typically described as less flexible because you can't just simply increase or decrease the valve like you can in the pipe network, putting it very crudely. There are certain elements that have to be accounted for contractually and commercially. There are practical constraints when you are shipping a commodity around the world that you have to account for in terms of the speed and consumption of a vessel, the role of weather, the impact of sanctions, the ability for ship-shore compatibility when a vessel turns up in an unloading port. Lots of different points where we talked about earlier with FSRUs about capacity. You might have chartered a vessel which is 170,000 cubic meters loaded at full cargo, and you want to send it to a market which has an FSRU which is of a smaller size. How do you unload that? You can't unload it all in one go. Do you do it in two loadings? Are you sent away? Do you unload the amount that you can and then trade the balance? There are lots of sort of these, what we would describe as logistical constraints to bear in mind. But for a lot of buyers, and I think this is a key change in the industry, which has really developed quite rapidly in recent years, the LNG buyer, so to speak, is not the traditional model of a simple importer importing the LNG, taking it onshore, regasifying it, selling it on as electricity, for example, in that market. A lot of LNG buyers now have portfolios in their business. They'll buy under a variety of contracts. They may have trading activity in certain markets. And so the concept of portfolio optimization is a critical feature now for parties and companies in the market. And this is where flexibility plays a really important role, not just in destination, but also in volume, which we'll come on to. But in destination, it features so heavily as a negotiation term now because of the value that's associated with it. A lot of people can look purely at a price, but the price can be influenced by the amount of flexibility that exists in that contract. And, especially as we've seen in the last 2 years, if we bring this into sort of real-time focus, at a time when you had supply and you operate on a model where you have access to shipping, you can send supply to markets with real demand. And in those markets of really high demand come lucrative pricing opportunities. And so when you're talking about optimizing your portfolio and ultimately increasing your profits and revenues, having that flexibility was a really valuable tool for a number of companies in the market. So you do see this a lot. Because it comes with such a lucrative value, there are often agreements in place whereby one party won't simply retain all of the benefit, but there can be a profit-sharing mechanism where a seller says to the buyer, you can have this cargo, and it was supposed to go to a port in Japan, but the Japanese buyer wants to send it on to China because there's a higher peak of demand there at the moment, that to do so, they work out between them the logistical elements of shifting the destination market. But then, as there's an increased value to that, there may be a profit-sharing element between buyer and seller. And that can be determined a lot of the time by the delivery mode again. So when we mentioned right at the start, FOB or DES isn't just as simple as who ships the product. There are these consequential elements to it, depending on the type of deal that you have. So what does this mean looking forward? I think moving forward, one thing we're seeing, and we said right at the start that we do a lot of front-end work in deal development. The topic of flexibility is right at the front of everyone's mind right now. And we'll come on to how it impacts on a volume perspective, but in the last 2 or 3 years, we've gone from a market where everyone who had a lot of supply didn't know what to do with it, and they had acute oversupply issues. There weren't therefore the lucrative opportunities in the market to sell on to other people, and you were stuck taking your gas and trying to look at your contracts to see if you could shift those volumes to later years, as quite often it's the case that you are subject to a take or pay commitment. So take the gas and pay for it, or pay for it if you don't take it. And so having these flexibility tools help protect you and insulate you from market pressures if demand is down, and provide you with opportunities sometimes if demand is high.
But again, I think some of this also, in order to take advantage of the destination flexibility and FOB contracts, there's economies of scale that are at issue. You have to have the ships to take the gas and move it around. And I think for a lot of smaller markets and a lot of the Central European markets that are just now thinking of how LNG is going to maybe start becoming part of the supply, I think, how realistic it is to think about all of the different options is hard to say. I mean, I think that it'll be, for Europe, and depending on which European market we're talking about, I think a lot of it will depend on sort of what kind of co-working arrangements you might be able to enter into with other partners in that regard. Okay.
So this is sort of shifting into the second limb, so to speak, of flexibility when we talk about volume flexibility. And I did make you a promise that we wouldn't go through too many acronyms, so we limited it to sort of 2 of the main ones here, UQT and DQT. As we were just saying, the volume flexibility option can also have real value. If we think back to when COVID started in 2020, if you had even a relatively small long-term import contract and businesses turned off the power, turned off the lights, turned off the computers, everyone went home, schools shut, shopping malls shut, your demand for power at the same volume reduced enormously, but your obligations under the contract remained for a lot of buyers to carry on taking and paying for this gas. Now, those buyers who had contracts with limited volume flexibility found themselves in a very precarious and difficult situation where they were trying to manage that incoming volume commitment. UQT and DQT are 2 tools available that you see quite often, but not always, in LNG contracts, which allow a party to better manage their volumes when demand goes down and when demand goes up, as the case may be. Now, they are not a complete free card, so to speak. There are some contractual consequences if you want to take less gas than you bargained for, less than the annual contract quantity in a year. Then this is where the make good and make up tools come into picture to ensure that while you might not have taken it this year, you're going to take it in a later year. And that the main sort of differences here between make good and make up, without simply just reading them off the slide for you, is when the timing of when you actually pay for that gas. But we've included these here because they are general and common features of these deals, no matter how big or small, but they played such an important role for parties in the last 2 to 3 years in managing what can only be described as a total roller coaster in the market, as demand went from one of the lowest profiles that we've seen in the market to one of the highest, and obviously we saw the impact on pricing that went with that.
I would add to that DQT and UQT rates often, per the terms of the contract, need to be exercised in the annual planning stage for a contract. And this, again, is a real difference between LNG contracts and pipeline contracts. So in a pipeline contract, you don't need to come up with an annual delivery plan 180 days before the start of the calendar year or the gas year. Typically, you've got an annual contract quantity. You might have a minimum annual quantity. You might have a summer seasonal quantity that needs to be taken. There's usually a formula in the pipeline contract that tells you what the DCQ or the daily contract quantity is. It's often basically the ACQ, not divided by 365, but divided by slightly less than 365. So the seller needs to make available on a daily basis a little more than sort of 1 day's worth each day. That's not how it works in an LNG contract. There's so much more forward planning. So this goes back to whether it's more or less flexible than a pipeline contract. And I think, as Max mentioned, the reason why there's so much more forward planning that's necessary is just because you've got the shipping element. And so you've got to have these LNG ships. You have to have time for them to rock up to the source, get loaded, figure out what the destination is, how much fuel they're going to use to actually get to where they're dropping off. Then you have to have a berth reserved for the time that they're going to unload. It's like, you can imagine it's like a gas station where you pull in and out. There's only a certain number of parking spots. They're reserved for certain days, and if you're not there, too bad, so sad. So it's just really... there's really rigorous planning that goes into play for an LNG contract. In the sort of August to November season before a calendar year, what's often called the sort of ADP season, annual delivery program, this is when the parties are working together to figure out which cargoes are going to be delivered on which dates and how much and so on. And a lot of contracts will require that the buyer or the seller notify at that time, so 180 days in advance, basically, or more, when the UQT or DQT is going to be exercised. Now, obviously, UQT and DQT have a lot more value if the contract doesn't require you to do that, and you can do it more spontaneously, because then you can make better use of pricing movements in the market to decide how much you're going to take and how much you're going to leave. But usually that is constrained by contract. So even though it is a flexibility tool, it's also in some way more of an option that has to be determined whether it's going to be exercised sooner rather than later. Is there anything else you want to?
Yeah, I would agree with Michelle, what Michelle said, because also UQT, DQT you applied, you need to come back in later years, either reduce your volumes or increase your volumes, and you don't know what the future price will look like. But it certainly gives you certain flexibility during the current year when you're planning for the next year based on the market outlook and your demand level to either choose exercise the option or not.
So what we've been discussing thus far is really the sort of core framework of what we would describe as a long-term LNG SPA, sale and purchase agreement. But not everyone, as we were discussing in the interval between these two topics, wants a long-term contract where they have an obligation to take cargoes every month or every quarter. They want a bit more flexibility and optionality as to how they do that. So there are agreements that you see in the market that cater for exactly this type of trading relationship between a buyer and a seller. These are often called framework agreements or master sale and purchase agreements, MSPAs. And what they do is they sort of sit exactly as the title would suggest, as the framework of trading relations. And as and when the buyer wants to contract and purchase a cargo or a number of cargoes, they have the overarching terms in place, and then they will agree the specifics in terms of the delivery windows, the shipping, the pricing, and any other logistical or temporal elements under what is called a confirmation notice. A confirmation notice is a very short trading document, effectively, which will document all of those bespoke elements of the trade and can be done and executed very quickly to allow clients, to the extent that there is product available, to transact very spontaneously and expeditiously in the market to try and take advantage of opportunities, either because they've got demand themselves or because they're using it for trading purposes. So in today's market, you do see an awful lot of these types of agreements. And the main reason for it is, for whatever reason, that company's profile and portfolio does not want to cater exclusively for long-term arrangements, and this gives them a lot of optionality and flexibility. So this type of model will be around for, I think, for a very long period of time, because it allows companies to include LNG in their energy mix, and then it often can be the starting point for then long-term contracts that then follow thereafter, once the familiarity and the trading exposure to this type of deal has been undertaken for a number of years.
And then finally, another major feature of any contract is what is the governing law. And in most of the European pipeline contracts with which I'm familiar, the typical governing law that I've seen in my experience is Swiss, Swedish, sometimes German and Austrian. But they're often civil law contracts, which makes sense because a lot of the suppliers were traditionally civil law jurisdictions, a lot of the buyers were civil law jurisdictions, and so it made sense to pick a sort of a neutral civil law governing law that often incorporated the CISG, the Contract for the International Sale of Goods of 1980. So there was also some kind of predictability about legal systems there. Now, most of the LNG contracts that I've seen, by contrast, are governed either by New York law or by English law. Those are, I think, the two most common governing law that you see in these contracts. Coming out of the US projects, it's New York law, and coming out of Qatar, I've seen both, and some of the Australian projects you're going to see, English law and so on. So those are the two sort of that are, I would say, definitely the most common in the vast majority. Why does this matter? Because there are disputes that inevitably arise with these contracts, and concepts of force majeure, frustration, impossibility, and so on often have a different complexion under common law legal systems than they do under civil law legal systems. And so there can be some legal unpredictability there, especially with a kind of a failure to deliver, where there might be a liability cap that's in place to be dislodged only in the event of willful misconduct, and what that means under the governing law then is really relevant if you're going to be constrained by the liability cap or not. So there are a number of different kinds of LNG-related disputes that we've seen spring up in the current market. I think it isn't any surprise that we've seen a lot of pipeline issues and disputes that have arisen post-invasion of Ukraine. Gas is a global market, so there is a knock-on effect to the whole global market in terms of what happens next as people try to take advantage of price movements in the market. And these are the sort of main heads of the type of disputes that we're seeing. Max, you want to maybe elaborate a bit?
Sure. I think it's fair to say that we've seen more gas and LNG disputes in the last 3 years than probably a chapter in the past. So many of these, and in particular I'll focus on two of them, and I'm going to be very bad and jump to the penultimate one on the list there, the cargo under delivery and missed cargoes, just because it ties in with a lot of the discussion we've had about these LNG deals. I think an expression you often hear is that a missed cargo is a crime of opportunity, and that was especially the case in the market that we've just sort of come out of, where there were epically high pricing issues going on globally, be it at the JKM marker in Asia, be it Eurogas prices here. And for a lot of suppliers, they looked at their contracts, they looked at the delivery profile, and they looked at the potential liability if there was a failure to deliver, as Michelle was saying. And there may be a contractual tool that they wanted to test or to rely upon, which allowed them to not deliver, and instead say to the buyer, please invoice us for a percentage of the value of this cargo. We will not give you the cargo, but you will be compensated to that percentage amount. And we will then take that cargo and sell it to someone else. Now, why is that particularly important in the last 3 years? Well, it's particularly important because of where the market price was. And there were a number of buyers around the world who may have had a contract price where the value of the cargo was $10 to $20 million. And yet the spot market was reporting sales for the same quantity at over $100 million. So if you're only being compensated, say, for $5 million as a liquidated damages payment, your seller goes and sells that cargo for $100 million on the market. You don't have that volume anymore. You only have $5 million, and you have to try and then replace it. And that means you could be at a net loss of $95 million if you went to market. Now, this type of activities existed in the market for a very long time. But it really did escalate in its frequency in the last few years. And there are a number of reasons for that, which are not just price, but the number of market players in the LNG world has expanded enormously. And they are not always the traditional model of buyer and seller. There are these sort of intermediary traders in the market whose business model is to arbitrage. And for those types of companies, having long-term contracts or MSPAs in place where they had access to volumes allowed them to really capitalize on some lucrative trading opportunities. So where does that fit in for the dispute size? Well, as a firm, and Michelle and I in particular have represented a number of parties in the market who have been on the receiving end of missed deliveries. And that comes down to, as we were just saying, a real key question of contractual interpretation. And that's where the governing law can play a really critical role in really examining what these clauses mean and what the consequences of failing to comply with them mean. And a number of those were dealt with in contested but ultimately resolved negotiations. But for many, it was not possible to resolve that, and they went through to the dispute resolution mechanics under those agreements, which, generally speaking, for the delivery and pricing disputes under long-term LNG deals, is resolved by arbitration. The main reason for that it really is the neutrality and the expertise and the confidentiality that arbitration brings for these types of cases, and also just the international nature of the deal. It's highly unusual, although not impossible, to find a local court jurisdiction in a long-term LNG deal, mainly because you might have a buyer in China contracting with a seller in Australia, and neither party wants to go and litigate a dispute in either party's home courts. So arbitration provides that neutral, independent forum. So we saw a lot of those cases. We also saw a huge number of force majeure issues. It was historically a position, and I'm not going to say this was a sort of globally accepted position, but sellers, generally speaking, didn't like to declare force majeure. And the main reason was reputational. They wanted to have a project which was considered the most secure and where security of supply was never in question, and a lot of the time actively marketed to the market to prospective buyers that we are one of the most secure projects in the world. We don't miss cargoes, we don't declare force majeure. We have, faultless operations here. But in the last few years, the market has, witnessed a number of quite atypical events, COVID being one of them, severe ice storms in America, terrible hurricanes coming up through the Gulf, impacting, if you look at the Freeport facility, it was impacted by that weather event, but it was also then impacted by a fire. Now, the force majeure issue, as Michelle said, is a crucial contract, and quite often the battleground, so to speak, is not actually the occurrence of the event, although that can raise some questions of interpretation as to whether the event being claimed actually qualifies under the clause. The main debate, so to speak, that you see in these cases is whether the performance has actually been impacted. And again, that comes down a lot of the time to causation, but also language in these deals if it's simply an obligation to have been impeded rather than prevented. Obviously, they carry different consequences from a practical perspective. But beyond that, and one of the main reasons the LNG market was so impacted by events of force majeure was if a seller like Freeport, which has a huge export profile, declared force majeure, they were not just selling on a sort of point-to-point basis to buyers in the market who were obviously impacted, but buyers were buying from Freeport and then selling on to other people. So you had chains of disputes. If seller A is delivering to buyer A and there's a force majeure and buyer A then becomes the seller B and is selling on to buyer B somewhere else, then they may have to declare force majeure downstream. And so for a period of time, we witnessed and read about quite publicly a huge number of these cases because of the sheer volatility in the market. And while these cases are still very present in the market, you often see them respond immediately to sort of unforeseen events, acute patterns of quite distressing weather, geopolitical shifts, military coups, or a massive production failure or issue breakdown of some sort. But there have been, as we've mentioned here, others, and quite a common feature in the European market has been termination and storage, and perhaps you want to talk about some of those.
I think just in the news, there were a lot of Gazprom long-term contracts, and when they stop delivering, what happens? Can you terminate the contract? When the contract's terminated, is that okay? Will there be litigation and arbitration that results as a result? Likewise, the storage situation changed in summer 2022 when the governments got very busy with trying to make sure that there was no unused capacity and that people were not sitting on their storage allocation, but that it could then be auctioned on a second or third party resale market. And there's been litigation about that as well. And then I think finally the price review is still alive and well, despite Henry Hub contracts typically not having price reviews. There are still European price reviews, and there are a lot of Asian price reviews as well that are on sort of regular cycles in terms of figuring out what the price should be and how it responds to a market that is changing quite quickly. In Asian price reviews, unlike European price reviews, it's usually not every 3 years, but every 5 years, and the market's actually changing much more quickly than every 5 years. So trying to figure out, what the most practical and sort of industry-safe price is going to be for a 5-year term in the current environment is extremely challenging. Do you want to talk about anything else you've seen sort of in the matters you might be working on?
Yeah, I mean, for the 5 disputes here, I think I work a lot on the 4 of them except the storage. But I would say for the right now, there's a lot of disputes regarding the cargo under delivery, either against the U.S., one of the U.S. exporters or some of the European sellers. So that's because of the arbitrage opportunity in the market when the TTF or JKM price rocked, and there's some issues related to that. And for the price review, I think Michelle already covered that very well. So for the difference between Asian price review and European, also because of the Asian price review are mostly built upon the benchmark contracts, which is different from the European price review, because European has established the gas trading hub, while in Asia, the JKM, the liquidity is still very low.
Just one last point from me here, and I know this always seems strange when you have arbitration lawyers and an expert consultant from arbitrations talking about disputes, because obviously everyone has an immediate perception that's all you want to talk about. But one thing that has really come through, I think, or should come through from the last 2 or 3 years, and these disputes, or these types of disputes that we have on the slide, is that these issues are ever-present and regular features of the deals that are being signed now and are being considered now force majeure clauses, price review clauses, termination clauses, liquidated damages clauses. And I think the sheer volume of disputes in the market has actually, as unpleasant as it has been for the companies to be in those disputes, has also shone a spotlight to some extent on some gaps in contracts that may have existed in their portfolios before. And if positives can be drawn from going through a dispute, it's sort of learning from the interpretation of a particular type of provision, or developing, bolstering, or impacting the scope of particular clauses, and in particular, the boilerplate clauses in contracts, which are often somewhat overlooked because they don't fall into those 4 key pillars that we mentioned earlier on price, flexibility, quantity, and term. They can often get lost or simply replicated from a prior deal that seemed to work pretty well. So I think what we'll find moving forward here is learning from some of these disputes and how they played out in developing some of these provisions a little further to try and, as best you can, and you obviously can't contract with certainty, but trying as best you can to anticipate similar events that may occur in the future market over the next 10, 15 years, and hoping that your contract may be more elastic, should we say, to be able to respond better to some of these movements, as acute or as gentle as they may be.
So I think that would conclude our remarks on this. Happy to take any questions on anything.
Thank you very much. So please, are there any questions here?
We're all very kind.
If not, of course, we can do it outside in a
course.
more informal way. Anyway, thank you very much for interesting information and your expertise. And I would like to thank our excellent speakers, Lily, Michelle Glassman Bock, and Max Rockall. They deserve your applause. Thank you very much. And also thank you for attention and attendance. And please, I would like to invite to a small refreshment outside. Thank you.